Aloha, my name is Sarah Julia Escobedo Brandenstein. Mahalo for attending my presentation, Entangled Empires and Indigenous Relational Ethics, Militarism, Tourism, and Coloniality on the Islands of Maui and Bohol. The motu of Honuo'ula on the southeastern coast of Maui has suffered rapid harm to human and more than human communities due to racial capitalism, tourism, and militarism. The imperial institutions that displaced my family from Bohol in the Philippines are currently impacting communities I love on Maui. By tracing connections between Maui and Bohol, larger entangled systems of imperialism are made visible. This project centers indigenous epistemologies and explores relational ethics across human and more than human communities encoded in our languages. Reattuning ourselves to these decolonial and anti-imperial practices can guide us to decenter the human and interrupt racial capitalism and ecological imperialism. From the early moments of contact with Europeans, the people of Hawaii and the Philippines have contested colonialism and imperialism. In 1521, Lapu-Lapu, chief of Matan, a small island north of Bohol, killed Ferdinand Magellan, the first European to reach the Philippines. In the following centuries, Filipinos led countless uprisings to reject colonizers. The most famous revolution began on Bohol in 1744, when Francisco de Godoy encouraged Boholano revolutionaries to reject Western epistemologies and build mutual aid networks to protect the land, people, and cultures of Bohol. The de Godoy Revolution endured 85 years, almost one-third of the Spanish colonial period. During the de Godoy Revolution, the first Europeans arrived in Hawaii. Captain James Cook arrived in Hawaii in 1778 and was killed by Kanaka on Hawaii Island about a year later. 7 years later, La Perouse landed on Kaeoneo Honuo'ula, becoming the first European to set foot on Maui. In 1893, American insurrectionists backed by US troops forced Queen Liliuokalani to yield her throne. The illegal occupation of Hawaii led to the construction of Pearl Harbor, the largest naval base in Oceania. 5 years after the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Philippines declared independence from Spain. But later that year, the US won the Spanish-American War and seized the Philippines, Guam, and Marianas to expand their military power in Oceania. During the Philippine-American War, American soldiers were instructed to murder any Filipino over 10 years old. In 1900, American Captain Andrew Wowan invaded Bohol, and Boholano revolutionaries obliterated the American troops. After the embarrassing defeat, the US soldiers retaliated by burning Anda and nearly every barrio on Bohol to ashes and murdering thousands of Boholano. American soldiers burned so much of Bohol that the neighboring islands were then impacted by the smoke. Patrick Worth argues that settler colonialism destroys to replace. On both Bohol and Maui, native communities were displaced and ecosystems were devastated by militarism and war and replaced by tourist economies. In the years leading up to World War II, the US dramatically increased the number of military personnel stationed in Hawaii and the Philippines and built their largest military bases in these regions on these occupied lands, making these islands targets. The influx of American soldiers and military-industrial complex co-created tourist industries and fantasies of paradise that overlay histories of violent imperialism. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese military attacked the Pearl Harbor Navy base on Oahu. Only 10 hours later, in the Philippines, the Japanese attacked US airfield bases Clark and Iba Field. The attacks on the Philippines and Hawaii and the devastating impact of World War II on Oceania is directly linked to the American military presence and occupation of Hawaii and the Philippines. In the days following the attacks of Pearl Harbor, the US military imposed martial law and seized coastlines of Honuo'ula, Maui, and the island of Kaho'olawe. In the name of national security, the United States violently evicted Kanaka from coastal communities, demolished villages, temples, and shrines, and bombed the Kinolau of Kanaloa. Near the end of World War II, the Japanese and American troops fought for 6 months in the Battle of the Visayas. Anda and many villages on Bohol were once again destroyed by imperial forces. It was during this hour that my grandfather swam from the shores of Anda to board a US Navy ship, and at only 16 years old, he enlisted in the military. After serving in World War II in Korea, my grandfather was brought to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then to Oakland, California. He only returned to Bohol once. When I asked him why he never wanted to return home, he said all he had found were fences blocking access to the places where he had grown up. Tourism had perpetuated the violent histories of militarism and displacement, preventing my grandfather from ever really being able to return home. Cynthia Knoll argues that militarism and tourism may be bound together as cause and effect. In the wake of World War II, imperial powers began to convert lands and communities disrupted by war into tourist destinations to serve American soldiers stationed in the Philippines and Hawaii. Before World War II, the population of Maui was about 45,000. But by the end of World War II, the population of military personnel alone totaled 100,000. At the end of the war, thousands of soldiers became Maui permanent residents who helped to vote in favor of Hawaii statehood, and thousands more returned yearly, becoming the foundation of Maui's tourist industry. Today, Maui and Bohol are two of the most popular tourist destinations in their archipelagos. Bernadette Gonzalez argues that tourism and militarism work together to maintain imperial power and domination over Hawaii and the Philippines. She writes that tourism established a certain ideological, political, and cultural order that normalizes the presence of the military, prioritizes its needs, and defends its central role in defining national security. Both rely on sedimented notions of colonized land and people, especially women, as passively there for the taking. The foundations of tourism and militarism are rooted in racial capitalism, coloniality, and imperial violences. By reattuning ourselves with the rhizomatic reciprocal relational ethics encoded in our languages, we can address these imperial violent systems and restore relationships across human and more than human communities. This project looks to Austronesian languages and traditional vernacular practices as an archive in relational ethics that can direct us towards politics and practices of liberation. Returning to traditional languages and vernacular practices allows us to decolonize our mind and change the ways in which we relate and connect across space. The Proto-Austronesian word "wan" means wide open space. This is a central spatial and relational framework that informs epistemologies of Moana Nui. Cognates of this root word, such as Kapwa in Tagalog, Va in Samoan, and Wa in Olelo, Hawaii, hold meaning associated with space, time, atmosphere, distance, and relationship. These vernacular practices inform political, social, and ecological relationships across space and time. Activists, artists, and scholars are enacting these concepts to contest coloniality and care for their communities, recentering the spatial relational ethics of Wa, Va, and Kapwa as vernacular frameworks works to oppose hierarchical systems and address contemporary social and ecological crises. By rooting our epistemologies in care, we can restore relational ethics rooted in reciprocal relationships, mutual aid, and traditional ecological knowledge. Kapwa vernacular practices are rooted in the understanding of the shared self, the shared common humanity, the entangled humanity, and the unity of the one of us and the other. Kapwa relational ethics oppose hierarchical social stratification, exploitative relationships, and supremacist ideologies. Kapwa culture nurtures a space of interwoven connections across human and more than human beings that inform our personal relationships and politics. Filipino activists are mobilizing Kapwa to call for full personhood to be extended to racialized people and those with disabilities. Kapwa practices help us to reattune ourselves to the entangled, intimate relationships between human and more than human entities. Environmental activists are calling for a return to Kapwa relational ethics to defend rivers, mountains, and forests. Katrin D. Lua writes that the scope of the Kapwa orientation reaches deeper. It anchors the mind of man in the memory of nature. When the concept is viewed within an ominous framework, it transpires how far the roots of Kapwa extend into ancestral memories. The shared self turns into a shared life. In Hawaii, the word wa describes a period, ara, or season, the space between intervals as between objects or time or in music. Wakea is the ancestral akua of the sky, partner to Papa, an ancestor of Hawaiian people and islands. Mauna Wakea on Hawaii Island is a sacred space being threatened by coloniality. Kanaka Oiwi scholars Hale, Nuuhiwa, and Tai Keegan teach that Wakea is the potentiality within a space. Papa is the foundation that grounds us to the present so that the potential is realized. Nu'uhiwa and Tegan argue that Kanaka Oiwi engage and reconceptualize Va through genealogical returns to Wakea. Wakea also stands in the space-time of potential becoming. Wakea moves from a Va that is undefined to one that is expansive Akea. These Va vernacular practices convey the spatio-temporality and relational ethics encoded into Olelo Hawaii. Va relational ethics were applied in viewing Akua, entities, and elements of Mauna Awakea as honored members of the community. The Kia'i of Mauna Awakea practiced mutual aid and indigenous relational ethics by setting up their own spiritual center, food distribution, health clinic, store, and even university, all free, built for and by the community. Scholars Nu'uhiwa and Tegan argue that the impact is so extraordinary that the current expansion of Hawaiian consciousness and politics resulting from the stand of Mauna Awakea replicates older models of being in the Va that sees the future as our past placed in front. Kawama mua, kawama hope. Wakea provides the space for possibilities and actions that span space and time, changing the course of a movement or regime. Engaging with Va in Hawaii interrupts hierarchical power structures and promotes politics of care. The use of Va as a framework to inform the spatiality and relationality of Mauna Awakea within the Hawaiian cosmologies and ontoepistemologies illustrates how recentering reciprocal relationships and nurturing space can lead to liberation. Samoan scholar Albert Wendt describes Va as the space between, not empty space, not space that separates, but space that relates, that holds separate entities and things together in the unity that is all. Malani Anai teaches that Tula Va is a spiritual experience. It's all about relational bodies literally affecting one another in the Va and generating intensities between and across Va. Va relational ethics offer lessons in traditional intimacies, relationality, care, and articulates how the spatial informs the relational and the ethical. One of my favorite things about art is that it is inherently spatial and relational. Art takes up space, creates space, and allows for us to bring others into those spaces to connect and form relationships. Samoan artist Regina Reggie Meredith Pitial uses art to create visual representations of vast spatialities and relational ethics in her powerful series, Va Filoni Moana, Relational Space, Domestic Violence, and Healing. In Pitial's artwork, the space between is a visual representation of the Va, or the sacred space between, and that connects individuals, families, and ancestors and communities. Pitial demonstrates the power of using art as a decolonial method. By rooting her artwork in indigenous relational ethics, motifs, and epistemologies, Pitial dismantles settler colonial logics and creates vast spatial and relational ethics. Yun Ramirez and Ramirez write that art has been a vehicle for the resurgence of indigenous knowledge, philosophy, and aesthetic through which indigenous communities can imagine and move towards indigenous survivance and futurity. The violent systems of militarism, tourism in Hawaii and the Philippines must be dismantled before the human and more than human communities are further harmed. Water, land, and national resources are being prioritized for tourists in Anda and Honolulu, while the people suffer and are displaced. A few weeks ago, the largest Balikatan military exercises were held in the Philippines. Indigenous communities are impacted by the military testing, bombs, and presence of soldiers. Next year, RIMPAC will bring together militaries from around the world to come together to practice bombing in Hawaii. We must transform the ways in which we relate to one another, with the environment, and with the more than human entities. Austronesian spatial relational concepts point to traditional ways of knowing, relational ethics, and politics that directly oppose imperialism, capitalism, and the oppressive systems at the root of environmental and social crises. Recentering reciprocal relational ethics pulls us to honor the personhood in those we see as others and nurture the space that relates us all. Indigenous relational ethics and politics deconstruct hierarchies and create spaces and futures that cultivate liberation. Mahalo piha.